Well, good evening, everybody. I think this mic is working. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Ramona Koval, and shortly it will be my pleasure and yours to be in conversation with Dennis Glover as part of the Melbourne City Reads series. But first, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Dennis Glover is an historian educated at Monash and Cambridge universities who's worked as a political speechwriter and advisor for a range of Labor politicians and is the author of many books, including 3 novels. His first novel, The Last Man in Europe, dramatised the last days of Eric Blair, better known by his pen name George Orwell, during which, dying of tuberculosis, he wrote 1984. His second novel, Factory 19, tells the story of an insurgency against the digital revolution set in Tasmania, where a factory is set up by an eccentric billionaire who's won his fortune by gambling and sets out to create the year 1948, when things for the workers were still solid.
Same year Orwell wrote 1984.
Yeah, I know. It's a favourite year of yours.
I wasn't born then, by the way.
I know that. Even I wasn't born yet. His latest novel is Thaw, and tells this one here, which you will be able to buy up the back later and get Dennis to sign. This tells the story of the tragic Scott scientific expedition to the South Pole and reconsiders what caused the fateful demise of the 5 British explorers in 1912.
And by the way, in 1948, the movie of Scott of the Antarctic was released. It's just a coincidence.
It's kismet, I think. And what the world began to learn because of their actions. But to start with, before we start talking about icy cold tragedy and myth and bravery, I really like the scope of your work. I mean, you like telling big stories in big contexts. 3 books which delve into history, but make the stories you tell chime with the present. So can we just start by talking about what drives you to tell big stories?
Politics, I think. If you look at my novels, the first one, The Last Man in Europe, about the writing of 1984, is really, I wrote to show that Orwell meant 1984 not to be any sort of science fiction or even a dystopian novel, but a novel about his own times, about the 30s and 40s, a world that, is looking very much more like ours every day. I mean, today, Prigozhin being executed by today's equivalent of Stalin. The 30s and 40s are coming back. And Orwell's warning in 1984 was, don't let it happen, it depends on you. So that was a sort of a political novel about the present, using the past as a vehicle.
So this is what drives you?
Yes, I consider myself a political novelist. First and foremost, and in the current times that we live, a political novel inevitably has to be about climate change, which is a political subject.
I just want to ask one more question just before we talk about Thaw. You're a speechwriter, you're a political speechwriter, you write novels with political elements. What works? What works better? What works better? Is it a sort of an oration, or is it people sitting in their backyards or on the beach with a novel that they are interested in because it's telling a gripping story, but also you're talking about politics in it?
If you had a good deliverer of a speech, writing a speech is a great vehicle. If you had Obama, you could get the world to do just about anything with the speech you give. We don't have them in Australia very much, unfortunately. And that's partly why I've chosen to write novels. But I've always wanted to be a novelist. I've wanted to be a novelist since I was at high school. And I got involved in politics at aged 18 got into student politics and then worked in politics. It was interrupted by a stint in Cambridge. And it's only after I'd had all that experience that I really felt confident to try my hand at writing novels, and in fact wrote a couple before I published, just to learn how to do it.
Have you got a couple in the bottom drawer then?
There's a couple in the bottom drawer. I don't think they're going to come out, but I've got another one on the front burner.
On the top drawer.
Yeah.
All right, now let's talk about the brave, crazy chaps, the explorers. And for those who haven't had much experience with this and what happened to the Scott team, can you first outline the elements of their story and the geography in which their story takes place on the Ross Ice Shelf?
Yes. Well, 1912, Robert Falcon Scott leads an expedition, a scientific expedition, to try and be the first people to the South Pole. He's beaten by the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, who uses dogs and moves much more quickly, doesn't do any science. Beaten at the pole, they trudge their way back across the Ross Ice Shelf, only to, look, I can give, it's like the Titanic, discussing the Titanic, we know it sinks, only to tragically die 11 miles short of their safety depot at One Ton Depot. But along the way, they undertook a lot of scientific experiments, collected lots of scientific data, which in fact informs a lot of our understanding of our climate today.
So you haven't always been a polar nut, though, have you? I mean, I believe that this interest took you when you were reading someone else's books on holiday.
It came at the beach on a really hot summer holiday. I rented a beach house in Lorne, and on the bookshelf was a new biography of Scott that the owner of the beach house had left behind. And I started reading it and thought, gee, this reminds me of, when I was young, and that thing about Oates walking out of the tent. And I remember all that from the 1948 movie. And before I knew it, I was lying on the beach reading Wikipedia, hitting all the connecting buttons, trying to figure out who done it, what it was all. And the story of Scott of the Antarctic is one of those enduring stories, and I think it's got a lot to do with it's a classic tragic story. It's got a bunch of disciples following a leader in search of something holy, the Holy Grail. It's like Moby Dick, it's even white. It's just one of those. It's a great story, great human tragic story that draws generations in, and it's led to these all of these people around the world who are absolute obsessives about this subject. And I nearly got lost myself delving into it.
All right. So there's two teams in these polar discussions. There's Team Scott versus Team Shackleton. Yeah. And sort of Shackleton is painted, I suppose, as a sort of modern manager in a sense. I mean, Shackleton's book is sort of all about don't tell them what they're having for dinner, make it a surprise. Yeah. So because they really need to be brought along and have excitement at the end of the day. And Scott is sort of supposed to be the sort of dour English sort of upper class chap who
a naval captain based his expedition around organisation and discipline, whereas Shackleton was this romantic figure who was a natural-born leader but was a terrible organiser. And in fact, there's the famous Shackleton expedition, where his boat gets crushed in the Weddell Sea, and they have to get into their little whale boats and go to safety. And it's a great, amazing, heroic story. But the untold part of that is that it was part of a two-pronged expedition, and the expedition he sent to the other side of Antarctica, people died because it was an absolute disastrously badly planned. People died, and when Shackleton went to rescue the people that he'd left behind in those whale boats on Elephant Island.
So upturned boats?
Yeah. They refused to allow him to lead that relief expedition because he was seen as an incompetent fool.
Oh, yeah. See, he's got good PR.
He got great PR. Scott got bad PR. And one of the problems that the Scots faced is in the 1970s, a chap called Roland Huntford wrote a terrible book about Scott, which painted him as an idiot. And I remember an upper class, English idiot. And they made it into a fantastic television series starring Bill Nye and all these great actors. You can see it on YouTube still if you want to look for it. And Scott's had a bad press ever since, and I wanted to set out to rescue his reputation.
Okay. What about horses versus dogs?
They took ponies because ponies worked for them previously. Also, they'd had bad experiences with dogs, you know, falling into crevasses and so forth. The British, if they'd had their time over again, they would have taken dogs, but they didn't. Dogs got much faster. They were beaten to the pole by the Norwegians because the Norwegians were great explorers who...
But they weren't on a
dogs.
scientific expedition either.
No, it was like... to understand the Norwegian expedition was like the moonshot in 1969, the Apollo moonshot, where they just like slingshotted themselves straight to the moon, you know, did a couple of desultory experiments just for the sake of the cameras, got back in and came back. You know, they made it simple. It was just a race, whereas Scott took along the paraphernalia of a scientific expedition, and that's what makes their expedition, in some ways, a more serious and memorable one than Amundsen.
And Amundsen sort of left a note in the tent at the South Pole saying, "Oh, hi, you can use anything we've left here for you
they didn't leave
once you
much,
get there."
by the way. Yeah.
But it was a sort of a real rub your nose in it thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, and see, Amundsen played a trick in one way because he knew that Scott was going. Scott had announced his big expedition. There was a lot of rah-rah about it. It took a long time to organise. Amundsen got a bunch of men on the Pram, the famous Nansen's famous boat, and said, "We're going to the North Pole." And as soon as they got out of the harbour, he assembled them all on deck and said, "Actually, boys, we're going south to beat Scott, and anyone who wants to leave can leave now." And they beat Scott. So it was a bit underhand. It was seen as not gentlemanly, underhanded.
Why was it that you wanted to rescue Scott? I mean, what was the attachment to you of Scott?
Brave, resourceful, courageous. But also I think the Scott expedition, because of its emphasis on science, made it an important expedition. They discovered lots of things that have formed the basis of our knowledge of climate science, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, part of your book is set in the current day. It has, one section and then the next section on the current day. Then we go back to the Scott expedition. In this current day fictional part, you've got the granddaughter of the meteorologist George Simpson, who's working to discover the role her grandfather played in the saga. So what's her interest? And tell me about George Simpson.
Simpson was one of the leading meteorologists of his day. After this expedition, he became head of the Met in the UK. He wanted to go south to try and fill in the great gap in the world's knowledge of our weather. So he set up a weather base as part of Scott's expedition to collect weather to try and figure out how the southern climate worked. He also provided forecasts to Scott about what sort of temperatures he would expect on the journey to and from the pole, and got them wrong. And so after this happened, the temperature records found in the tent with Scott and his companions' dead bodies proved that the temperatures got 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit below what Simpson had expected them to get. And so he had this is a true story, he had a collapse, a mental breakdown, and then devoted much of the next decade of his life to trying to figure out how he could have got it wrong. And in the process of doing that, the data that he collected, which, including some of the data that was found in the tent with the dead bodies, was used by colleagues of his to determine the nature of the southern oscillation, El Nino and La Nina, and in the process figuring out how the climate worked. So, for instance, before this, everybody thought that the climate variations happened largely because of sunspots, sun activity. He proved that it happened because of the interchange of energy between the atmosphere and the oceans, laying the basis for our understanding of climate change. And now with us putting CO2 into the atmosphere, knocking all that out of kilter, climate change is occurring. So what I wanted to do was rescue Scott for the era of climate change and show the relevance of this expedition to today.
And rescue Simpson too, in a way? Or point out sort of the tragedy of what he didn't know at the time.
Yes, well, he's the linchpin of this because if you want to make it a story of science, you have to have the story around the leading scientists of the expedition, and he was that. Yeah.
And so, what made you think that you'd use his granddaughter for a tale of daring do?
Well, there's a scientist in America called Susan Solomon. She's a professor of MIT, and she's the person who explained the nature of the ozone the ozone layer hole above Antarctica. She's very famous. She's also an obsessive about Scott, and she wrote a book in which she told Simpson's story, and using contemporary weather data, the now in automated weather stations spread across the route that Scott took, across to the pole and back, she proved that Simpson's later theory of what killed Scott about this 20 to 30 degree temperature plunge was right, and that in some ways his forecasts that he gave them were accurate, but they suffered unluckily from a 1 in 20 year weather anomaly. And using the modern data today, she shows that this anomaly occurs once every 20 years, something they couldn't have known back then. So I wanted to find a character roughly to base her upon, and I chose sort of a feisty modern day feminist academic who could take up the cudgels for Simpson.
And she, of course, goes to the Cambridge Scott Polar Research Institute because she's looking at all the, the data, and she's looking at all kinds of things. So I want to know what happened to you when you visited there, because you spent a week there, I think, didn't you?
Yes, I went back there to do some research. I wanted to sort of embed myself in the Scott Polar Research Institute.
Tell me about this institute and what happens there.
It's not far from the centre of Cambridge. It's this beautiful sort of library building that was constructed in honour of Scott, and it's now become one of the leading sort of institutes in the world to fight to save Antarctica. So it's a sort of, even though they told me, and this comes up in the book all the time, we're not advocates. We're not militant. We're not any of like this. We're just scientists trying to find the truth. They're strong pursuit. They're strong on the cause of climate change, and it's this wonderful building that has all of the records of the Scott expedition there. So I went there to go into the archive and see from the handwritten sources from Simpson and Scott himself, to just get a feel for the place, how it worked, meet the characters, and I based a lot of my characters in the modern day sections on these people that I met.
So as a historian then, I mean, you've got all the sort of documents, the primary documents, but you can't really do much with them, can you, because you're not a scientist. But you can see the handwriting and you can see all of that. How do you start working with it? What goes on in your mind when you see that? I mean, if I saw it, I'd sort of think, that's amazing, that's their handwriting.
Yeah.
What was it like for them when they were writing that? But what do you see?
I see all of that. There are letters. If you go to their museum at the Scott Polar, they've got the original letters that were written in the tent, that they wrote. And I'm just, I'm an historian, I'm a history buff, and I just loved looking at that stuff. They've also got artefacts, the sleeping bag that Oates used that they had to slit open so he'd get his frozen foot out so it would stay frozen and not thaw out so he wasn't in pain. All of these sorts of things, it's all there. All of the equipment that they used, the camera that they took to the pole to take the photographs, it's all there. And it's amazing.
I think you should read now and just give people a little flavour of that very that famous scene that nobody witnessed that you write about.
Yeah. This is the famous scene that everybody probably knows involving Oates on the expedition. And just by way of background, at this stage, it's late in their journey back, and there's still hope that the dogs that are being sent from their base camp would arrive to save them at the last minute. They'd organised for this, but the dogs didn't show up. And, in all of the obsessive fighting over what happened to Scott, who's to blame is a big question. So here we go. Wilson leant over and offered some of the opium to Oates, but Oates's hands were numb and useless. He opened his broken, blood-corked lips, and Wilson placed 2 tablets into his mouth. "More, Bill." Wilson hesitated. "I want to sleep, Bill, and not wake up. Please, Bill, please." He was crying. Bowers had frozen tears on his cheek. "Lawrence, no, the dogs." Wilson took at least a dozen more tablets, placed them in Oates's mouth, then scooped some lukewarm tea from the Nansen cooker and helped him swallow them. "This should be enough, soldier." Oates painfully wriggled into his bag. He wanted to say something heroic, some generous farewell, but the pain was too intense to enable him to think. "Good night, boys." He closed his eyes and seemed to lose consciousness. But Wilson had miscalculated. The opium soon wore off, and Oates, in a state of near delirium, began to moan. After 2 hours, it built up to a continuous strangled scream. They all looked at each other desolately. There was no point in trying to sleep. Bowers brewed some tea. The screaming got louder, and Oates jolted himself awake. Sweat and tears had pooled into a frozen layer on his skin. He said in a frightened voice, the first time they'd ever heard that tone, "Mummy." "Some tea, Titus?" Oates raised his head and saw Wilson empty a dozen more tablets into the mug. Oates gulped the tea down, Wilson holding the mug to his mouth while also holding him up. Using his elbows for leverage, Oates rolled onto his chest, wriggled his body out of his bag and dragged himself over to the entrance, letting out a gasp of pain as his bare foot scraped on the canvas floor of the tent. He lay there, prone, holding his numb and useless hands to the knotted tent cords. "Please," he said. Scott, closest to the entrance, rubbed his hands together to circulate the blood and get his fingers moving. He then untied the entrance strings. It was blizzing, and a drift of comparatively warm, moist air and snow blew into the tent. Oates half turned back to face them. "Boys, I'm just going outside. I may be some time." He crawled out. Scott retied the tent flap. Wilson said a prayer. Bowers put his face in his hands.
Isn't that good? So where does history and imagination intersect for you? I mean, as an historian, do you have rules with yourself about what to make up and what to leave alone?
In this sort of story that where you're going to be instantly shot down if you get anything wrong, you have to be very close to the facts. There are silences that you can fill with conjecture, but it has to be plausible conjecture. That's the nature of it. You can't make things up. The moment you exaggerate too much or say something that's been shot down by other historians of the subject, you're going to get mauled and your book's going to lose credibility. So you've got to keep it as close as you can to the facts. And in this novel, I don't know any areas where I've strayed so far that I'm really going to get savaged by the critics. I've had to change a name or two here and there because some people had the same Christian name. I didn't want to confuse people, stuff like that. But generally, it's a good, solid historical story.
So the opiate, tell me the stories about the opiates.
Well, they took vials of opium tablets to help ease their troubles, as they put it, if everything went wrong and they wanted to commit suicide. That's not something they would ever have discussed, but it was there for a reason because polar expeditions could easily go wrong. And there were arguments about whether or not, there are arguments among the historians about whether or not they took them. I come down on the side that that Oates at least took them.
Why? What's the evidence?
He was in such screaming agony by this stage. His foot had gone gangrenous, and he was at the end. And
is that because Scott wrote about it?
Was written out. The tablets were written about ambiguously. No one's 100% sure.
But about the agony in the foot.
Oh yes, for those who haven't read Scott's famous diary, you should if you're interested in this subject because it's beautifully written. Story about their especially the last days of their journey, and he outlines the terrible agonies that they were all going through.
And do you
Oates.
think Scott thought that the dogs wouldn't come and knew that this would be the only record of what was going on in that tent?
By this stage, but near the end, they were played out. Ranulph Fiennes, the famous explorer of today, tried to recreate Scott's journey and realised that at one point that had he not been able to ring up and get an aeroplane to come and pick them up, something Scott's men could never do, of course, that they would have died if they'd kept going. You get to a certain stage of exhaustion, hypothermia, hunger, weakness, and in plunging colds where the surface turns, in effect, like trying to drag your sled over sand, you just can't make any progress, and they knew that they were going to die. By this stage, the dogs should have arrived. He'd organised for a team of dogs to be led by Mears, played by Bill Nye in the modern adaptation, and Mears, for some reason, funked it and didn't want to go, and so the dogs never found them. In fact, Apsley Cherry Garrard, one of the other famous characters in this story, took the dogs and stopped at One Ton Depot, 11 miles short of where they were. Yeah. And then, as a result of that, felt so guilty that he had a nervous breakdown and lost his sanity in the years that followed.
And of course, he went on the worst journey in the world,
yes.
to sort of shoot off scientific expedition and to collect penguin eggs,
yes.
which were going to prove something very important about the evolution of penguins and birds.
Yes.
And just, his story of how they just, across terrible, terrible terrain and cold and rocks and with these penguin eggs.
Yes.
And then he sort of takes them back to the Natural History Museum and knocks on the door and says, I've got these penguin eggs. And they said, oh, we're not interested.
Yes, that's right. They went 100 miles in the middle of winter in Antarctica and almost died several times. Scott's men got temperatures as low as minus 47 Fahrenheit, and they got minus 76, I think. And it was so cold that you just, every part of you would shatter, your teeth would smash, you couldn't sleep, you couldn't do anything. They just could have easily died, but they were such hardy people, but such thoughtful people. They hung together as friends so strongly that they showed that they were an incredible breed, these people that went down there.
And what of the Natural History Museum? What of the people who said they're not interested in these samples?
Well, they weren't then, but of course these eggs are amongst their most prized possessions now, along with...
But he actually left. He left with the eggs on that day.
Yeah.
No wonder he had a breakdown.
Yes. Yeah, and, but they did these sorts of things all the time. One of the things that people don't realise about Scott was on the journey back, at the top of the Beardmore Glacier, in the Transantarctic mountain range, they stopped to collect rocks. Even though they were racing against the clock to try and survive, they had promised their geologists that they would stop and gather rocks because it was important for the science of geology. And they got pieces of coal that had the fossilised remains of ancient ferns in them. Even though they were dying, they continued with these 20 kilograms of rocks. They kept them in their sledge right to the very end. And when the rocks were found, people realised that those ferns proved that Antarctica had once been green and lush. The ice had melted before and can melt again. So it was proof of that, as what we would now call climate change.
Absolutely. Now, you're really fantastic at sort of evoking the pain, the misery, the pus, and the cold, and the waterlogging, and the terrible sort of the strength that they had to sort of call upon to just...
I hate the cold, Yeah.
Now, I'm just going to ask you, what's your research for this? Because how did you make me shiver when I was reading it?
The wonderful writings that they brought back when they described what happened, but also what the modern explorers tell us. As I said before, Ranulph Fiennes went and wrote about, tried to actually reenact the Scott journey and wrote about the effect of it on your body. They would weigh themselves every night. They turned themselves into an experiment to figure out what happens in these plunging temperatures, and felt for themselves the effects of hypothermia slowly taking over their body and their minds, and realised just what a close shave it is between life and death in these situations. Ranulph Fiennes had to cut off his own toes because they got gangrenous and stuff like this. I mean, these,
So
terrible.
what's your method of getting there? Sort of like a kind of actor who decides to sort of try to put himself into these characters. Is that what you do?
Try and don't spare the reader. That's the method. Make it as terrible
as it was.
As it was. Yeah. I mean, there's no. You're not doing the reader any favours by making it sound easy.
No, but I mean, you're writing it. You write as if you're feeling that cold, but you say you don't like the cold, so you didn't sort of go to the snow or anything and be adventurous one evening and. No. Because if you have a look at some of those if you go to a museum and have a look at some of the gear that they had, it's just I mean, you wouldn't go camping in Australia with that kind of gear, with these sort of leather outfits that were not particularly warm. I mean, they were probably the warmest thing they could get at the time, and these great big wool things and heavy things that got wet. And
sleeping bags made of reindeer skins. And it didn't keep them very warm at all. In fact, the thermal capacity of this stuff is would be less than half of the clothes that they wear now. If they had those clothes back in those days, they probably would have survived. But
I mean, I've worn mucklucks made of sealskin in northern Canada, and they're amazingly warm. You can they feel like socks, and you're walking in snow. Yeah. But they didn't take that sort of thing.
No. They had fur boots, woolen, just pullovers, woolen trousers, canvas windproof coverings. Because they were dragging, they couldn't wear. Amundsen and his gang wore, toe to top of head in fur, dressed like the Inuits. But the British couldn't because they were man hauling. All that Amundsen had to do was sit on the back of a dog sled, whereas they had to actually walk and pull. And if they wore all those heavy furs, they would have sweated too much and frozen.
So nobody's found the tent yet?
No, the tent, a lot of the crazy obsessives that follow this have written academic papers.
Tell me about the crazy obsessive. I should have asked you before about that.
As in any subject, there are crazy obsessives. When I wrote about George Orwell, I became a member of the Orwell Society, and there are all these people who know more about Orwell than Orwell himself would have known. They spend their whole lives to every little minute thing of what he did on every day they know. And it's the same, be the same with Jane Austen's society, I imagine, and so forth. With Scott, it's the same. And there are a bunch of people who coalesce around a famous journal called The Polar Record, which in my novel I've renamed The Polar Quarterly. And they argue intensely over who killed Scott. What was it? Was it the wrong food? Was it the dogs weren't sent? Did they wear the right clothes? Was there treachery? Was someone too cowardly to go on the ice and try and find them? All these sorts of issues come up all the time. So the obsessives just try and control the narrative. So I've sort of portrayed them in my novel, these people who coalesce around this journal.
Because you basically sort of send up this crazy crazy journal. Yes. They'll publish anything by the look of it.
It's peer reviewed, but it's a pretty small pretty small group of peers. Yeah.
So they haven't found the tent. So they got the bodies.
To get back to that, the tent. There are articles in the Polar Record. Trying to figure out where the tent would be now, using measures of ice flow and ice fall, and they figure that it's about 50 miles closer to the ice front now because the ice shelf moves towards the sea. 50 miles closer to the ice front, and so many metres below the surface of the Earth, and they try and calculate at the point at which the bodies will drop into the ocean when the ice front calves into the sea. Some of the characters in my novel get it into their mind that they will go with the surface of the Ross ice shelf starting to melt, that this will come to the surface and they will find the tent and the evidence in it in order to propel the fate of Antarctica back onto the front pages of the newspapers.
So they reckon that the people who discovered them and that saw that evidence didn't see everything, or weren't able to document everything that they might be able to see themselves.
They thought that something might have been left in the tent, some piece of evidence that would explain the tragedy even further.
And the tent was just shut up and the bodies were left in there?
Yes, what happened? Yes, 8 months after they died, a search team went out, miraculously found the tent, collapsed the tent around their dead bodies and buried them in the ice, erected a big, huge cairn and cross above them. There's a famous photograph of it. And in modern day Antarctica, in my novel, the surface starts to melt and history starts to come back up to the surface.
And are there really 3 kinds of shivering?
Well, this is what they say. You have, I can't remember what all 3 are, but the last one, your teeth start to smash and you can't sleep, and it's just so intense that you just have to get up and get moving or you're going to die in your sleeping bag.
No, I was impressed by that sort of research. So bravo for writing about the physics of the polar winds and the southern oscillation, because you wrote about it, and I'm very impressed that you would dare to do something like that in a novel, because it's always hard to explain scientific things to anybody, really, and it's hard to actually not go, oh, and now we'll have a break from our advertisers who are going to explain to you the polar winds and the southern oscillation, but it's not like that for you. How did you manage to do that?
Well, there's a lot of exposition in a novel like this because you're trying to explain the birth of modern climate science. You're trying to explain history. You're trying to explain what the freezing surface of ice shelves mean for your ability to pull, all these sorts of things. So you have to be continual on your guard and trying to think of fresh ways to try and explain them. So there are lectures that are given. There are just discussions of people walking out onto the ice who go back and tell a story, and so forth. So you just have to keep getting in your mind. Don't make it sound like make it sound like exposition. Try and make it come across in conversation, and that sort of thing. So you just have to be on your guard. It is a real danger in a novel like this to slip into just lecturing people and making it sound not like fiction but like a textbook.
So what did we learn from these expeditions that can be useful for what's happening on the Ross Ice Shelf now? Because we're seeing articles about it quite often in the last year.
Yeah. Well, in the last month or so, we've seen the hottest day on record, the hottest week on record, the hottest month on record, the hottest year on record. We've seen the sea ice around Antarctica get to record lows, which has got people in the scientific world, the British Antarctic survey leaders and so forth, to say that they are truly scared now about what's happening, and that they think that Antarctica is actually getting out of control and melting at a far greater rate than even the worst case scenarios in official science are willing to admit. And in my novel, I sort of speed it up. Well, I thought I was speeding it up. That's the thing. When I was writing it, people may have seen that movie The Day After Tomorrow, where climate change happens in about 48 hours. Mine's not sped up quite that much, but I'm speeding it up. But it seems that not enough. And one of my friends who's a scientist who was pushing information at me, every day he would send me another Guardian article saying, record ice loss on Antarctica, more dug up from retreating glaciers. and so forth, he kept saying to me, look, you better hurry up and get this novel out or it'll be history rather than the future. Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you explain to people who say, but hang on, didn't it used to be a tropical paradise at one point? It wasn't icy. I mean, that's what was found in the rocks.
Yes, that just simply proves that it's melted before and can happen again. Over vast periods of human history. It's just that with climate change, we're speeding that process up, so that it's not natural. It's human induced. So it's just a warning to people. I think the story to get out of this for humanity is that Antarctica is in danger, and I was looking to trying to find a story to put this back on the front pages, and that's what my character set out to do. They want to find the tent because they know it's a dramatic story to put Antarctica back on the front page. And in fact, whilst I was doing the story, whilst I was writing it, I invented this scene where they found Shackleton's ship at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, and lo and behold, a year and a half ago, after I'd written that scene already, they actually did it. And they did it because the Weddell Sea was ice-free at that year, which has never happened before. So in some ways it was my novel coming to life before my eyes.
So what political action would you like to see as a result of writing this book and people reading it?
Well, I'm just contributing to a vast literature and news that comes out every day about Antarctica. My book will be a small drop, of melting ice in the ocean. But there's no two ways about it. I mean, I'm not here to be a prophet about climate change or anything, but there's no two ways about it. We've just simply got to slow down and stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, because the ice that is present in Antarctica alone will raise global sea levels by 80 metres if it all flows into the sea. People don't realise that Antarctica is like a giant basin like this, filled with ice. There is masses and masses and masses of ice in there, and once that melts, which it is doing now much faster, we're all in trouble. And one of the relevance of the Ross Ice Shelf for that is that the ice shelves are like plugs holding all of that ice from the land-based ice on the land. And once the ice shelves go, it's all going to plunge into the sea much faster and raise sea levels. So if the Ross Ice Shelf goes, as it does in part in my novel, I won't give it away.
No, don't give it away.
We're all in deep trouble.
Well, I'm going to say that in the next couple of minutes I'm going to ask for audience questions. So if you've got a question for Dennis, if you could put your hand up, and there's some roving microphones around, and the rule is you're not allowed to ask anything until you've got a roving microphone under your nose. Then we'll all be able to hear it. So can you have a little think about what you'd like to ask, and then perhaps put your hand up, and then we can get your question. So with this idea about writing speeches,
Yes.
why don't you write a really great speech for somebody to deliver in our current political
On climate change?
Economy, yeah.
Well, they've just got to ring,
So you
I'm
say
waiting.
They're not ringing.
Oh, some of them are, not to write about climate change.
No,
but,
I'm asking about writing about climate change. Why isn't your phone ringing?
well, they've got, their own speechwriters, I guess.
But have you heard any interesting speeches about climate change?
We don't hear the grand story. That's the thing. Whenever I used to write, when the Labor was last in government and Peter Garrett was the minister, I wrote for him. And I found that no matter who was the minister for the environment, it's a struggle to get them to think big picture and start talking about the big things like Antarctica and global temperatures and, the fact that we're rushing towards we're accelerating towards a brick wall, and we have to do something about it because the politics of it are so hard. And
what are the politics of this?
Well, we've seen it the last few days over water rights, haven't we? The moment we figure out that we have to put more water back into the rivers to save our rivers and our fish and our fauna and so forth, they just come out and say, oh, the farmers will get too upset, we can't promise too much. And it's that with everything. If we have to stop burning coal, oh, we'll lose the coal seats. The politics of this are absolutely diabolical. And I'm just thinking that we have to get to the stage where something absolutely terrible has to happen before they'll wake up and do something about it.
What sort of terrible?
Well, your definition of terrible gets worse every year. I mean, remember the terrible fires a few years ago? It's like they're forgotten now, although, El Nino's coming back this year. Who knows, it could happen again. Perhaps a big chunk of the Ross Ice Shelf needs to break off and everyone to go, oh my God, it's really starting to happen. But, just in the last week, we've seen that city in Hawaii completely wiped off the face of the earth by a powerful firestorm pushed by a hurricane. It's happening. And, it's like, I mentioned earlier about Orwell and the 30s and 40s. In some ways, we're like the people were in the 30s and 40s who turned their eyes away from Stalin and Hitler until it was too late and the war happened. And we're turning our eyes away from what's happening to our environment, maybe until it's too late. And then it'll be much harder to undo the damage.
On that cheerful note...
yeah, sorry.
Do we have a question?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. And I've started the book and I'm really enjoying Thaw. I just want to ask you, you're sort of re-examining Robert Scott and Amundsen. What would you say about Douglas Mawson? Is he the hero that he's supposed to be?
Well, I'm not an expert on Mawson, but Mawson was an amazing man who survived on his own after a terrible... terrible events, his friends falling down crevasses and that sort of thing. And he was incredibly brave. But the really interesting thing about the Australian Antarctic story is that it was very much science-based. They weren't trying to be the first to the pole. There wasn't that idea of a race. It was about science, and that's a great credit to Australia. And we have a great history of Antarctica, of Antarctic science, and it's something we need to keep going. I mean, I noticed lately that we've cut funding to Antarctic research in Australia, which is just insane. Yeah.
Another question.
Hello. Hi, Dennis. You had romance in Factory 19. Is there any, little bit of romance?
Oh, yeah.
There is. I can attest. There is.
Oh, yes, very much there is. There's a sort of a steamy relationship between the 40-year-old head of the Institute and Missy Higgins, the 33-year-old sort of climate change activist adventurer who goes to the Institute to write her great-grandfather's story. It's a hard thing to do these days, of course, because writing about romance within a university is fraught with danger because you can be accused of inappropriate behaviour, the older man accused of inappropriate behaviour. But I've made it so in my book that she's actually the much more aggressive one, and he's the one trying to protect himself. Yeah.
So is it important to have romance in the novels you read? Yeah.
Very much so, yes.
I think actually the three novels have all got a steamy side, haven't they?
We have to sell books.
So you're not committed to steam? Is that what you're saying? Only ice?
Oh, no, I like writing about it.
All right, I won't ask any more personal questions. Another question, I think. There's one coming up.
I also revisited Factory 19 this morning, and your opening line is, to paraphrase, things cause trouble when billionaires get bored. And you wrote that book in 2020, and Elon Musk just bought Twitter like a couple of months ago.
Yes.
Yes. How often do you think history actually predicts the future? And does that provide you optimism or pessimism?
I don't think history so much predicts the future, but it gives us warnings. In the Orwell story that I wrote, it's a true part of the Orwell story that after 1984 was published, Orwell lay dying in his sanatorium, and the book was being misunderstood by the reviewers, some of whom thought it was an anti-socialist novel and was against the Labor Party and so forth. Orwell was incensed and called his publisher to come and visit him and told him to take notes and publish a letter in which he said, it's not an anti-socialist story, it's a warning about the future. Don't let it happen, it depends on you. And that's the story of 1984. And I think for me, I sort of live in history. I saw that film Oppenheimer the other night, and everyone was saying, he was saying, I feel it, I sense it. The crashing atoms, the matter breaking up. He feels it, he can see it. That's how I feel. I've been intensely interested in history since I was very young, and I've always sort of looked around. In some ways, when I go to, especially when I go overseas where things are much older, I look around and I see the past embedded in buildings. So I'll look at a famous part of London, I'll see a gap, where there's a modern building, and I'll think that's where a Luftwaffe stick of bombs hit, and that beautiful old building that had been there since the 1400s was wiped out. I think about history all the time, and so when I wrote Factory 19, I pondered what was missing, what's been lost, and I journeyed back to where I grew up and went back to where the factory buildings were in Dandenong, where my parents worked, and they're still there. They're just being used as warehouses. So I grabbed a clipboard, I put on a helmet and a safety vest, and I walked through as if I was doing some sort of engineering audit, and walked through the building and had a look. And remembered a part of the Heinz factory where I'd worked myself when I was an undergraduate as my factory job. And I went to the places where my father worked and so forth. So history's all around us. If you have a historical mind, you can sense it, you can see it, but you've got to know what to look for.
But if it happens once, it can happen again.
Yes, well, that's the thing. If something can happen once, it can happen again. If if Antarctic can melt once, it can melt again. If Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Franco can come to power once, Putin and Trump and others can come to power now. And the patterns are the same. If you think about it, in 1923, the beer hall putsch in Munich, Hitler tries to stage a coup. They arrest him, they're going to execute him, but they let him off, put him in jail, let him out after a few years. Trump's tried to stage a coup. Will they let him off? I say no.
You say they won't.
I say they shouldn't.
I know, but will they?
I've got a sense that the US legal system is much more robust than we think, and that people who want to defend, and that the real defenders of the American Constitution are the lawyers and the judges, and they may do the right thing by the human race. It could just save us all.
So, okay, I won't ask any more. What about another call? Another question?
I was wondering if you ever read a poem called Fire on the Snow. I studied it at school, and I can't remember the author's name, unfortunately, but it seems to resonate with a lot of what you said. Yes.
Funnily enough, I know about that, but for some reason I never read it.
Does anyone know who it's by? Douglas
Stewart. That's right. Yes, that's right. Someone mentioned this the other day too, but I've never... I don't know, sometimes things just pass you by.
Well, talking about passing you by, why don't people have a good sense of history? Is it that it's not taught properly anymore? I mean, why doesn't everybody say, this sounds like what happened with, Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler? Why does it have to be a quiet voice of a historian sort of positing it?
It's not studied as much in schools and universities as it was. Although there are excellent subjects at high school. Everyone knows their revolutions subject. My kids both studied it. A lot of people here's kids probably, or maybe yourself studied it. University, fantastic subject that teaches about how our politics of the modern world evolved. But young people are interested in other things, you know. They're not so much interested in reading history. They're not so much interested in reading books per se. You know, they get their stuff from the internet. They're interested in modern questions. They're interested in climate change, these sorts of things. And really, we can't tell them what to read. We can't lecture them. You know, back in 1968, during all that revolutionary period, you wouldn't have told them to go back and study theology. Kids will study what they're interested in, and they're young and they're idealistic, and they'll take the world in the paths it needs to go.
But they have been educated to think that there aren't any facts and there aren't any truths, which is rather odd if they're thinking about climate change and they're depending on science.
Yeah, I don't think they're taught that at school. I think they're just...
Oh, at university.
Or university. They're taught... They get it from the internet. You know, they get it from Twitter and social media. Facts don't have any meaning. The history is twisted.
But I think it started in the universities probably about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, postmodernism sort of has turned into something else now where everything's about representation rather than reality. Yeah.
What about another question from this fine audience?
Hi. Thanks, Dennis, Sam, so much for that. I haven't read the novel, but I'm really looking forward to it. This was just something to share because I know this is something that you know.
Yes.
But just given this is part of Melbourne City Reads and you've talked about having history around you, I just wanted to let the audience know, if they didn't know, that we have, you know, a building and a connection through Melbourne University with Scott's party, because Raymond Priestley, who was the first Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, was in Scott's Northern Party and wrote his own book and memoir about that. So the Raymond Priestley building, which many people may know, is there, seems to be all about administration, but there's that strong connection with the Scott Polar Institute through him when he went back to England, but also just that point that you make about history being all around you and the connections that are there, even somewhere in Melbourne. I think it's just a really great point that you make through that.
Yes, good point. I agree. Yes.
Yes. Is there another question? Did I see? No? Am I getting... I've been told not to put my hand over... No, okay, fine. One more question from me and then we're going to wrap it up. I'm always amazed that people working in archives for years and years and years in the same archives come up with new stuff. I mean, how is that possible, that they're working with the same documents that have been read and read and read and read? How do they find new things?
Often the material is just staring you in the face and you don't know what to look for. Simpson's part in the Scots party has been sort of overlooked for a long time, and I think it's only now in the era of climate change that we want to look at the origins of modern meteorology. And it was at that time that modern meteorology was found. So now we go back to Simpson rather than going back to the geologists or going back to the more heroic elements. We look for different things in each generation, and the story becomes more relevant. So, you know, in the 1970s, the Scott story was used to ridicule, you know, the British ruling class and to ridicule the empire. Now it's looked at. Now I think through me, I think I'll be starting this sort of new way of looking at Scott, which is to see them as the founders of modern scientific understanding of Antarctica, which in the era of climate change is absolutely crucial to the whole climate, not just the Antarctic climate.
Well, our booksellers tonight are from Paperback Books, and they have, as I said before, Dennis's books up for sale at the back, and I'm perfectly sure he will sign them for you now, because it's time to say goodbye, because we're out of time. I think if you've got a question that you like to ask privately, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer it while he's signing your book. So please thank him for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.